Okay. So my name is Kim Steiner. I'm recording this video for a friend of mine who asked me about what a level designer does at work all day. And it's really funny because there's actually a video on YouTube already of that's called "A Day in the Life of a Level Designer," and it's really funny because it was made by some people who were not game developers. Like they came into our studio and they just recorded stuff all day, and they very clearly did not actually understand what I did all day. So this is actually a really common question that I get asked a lot, and I thought, well, maybe I should make this video for her because it's a lot easier to understand when you see it as opposed to it being like written out in text. Um, and so I wanted to make this video for her, and then I thought, well, it's actually a really common question that I get asked a lot, and so maybe I should just make a video that like kind of generically explains it. So let me actually start by explaining who I am. My name is Kimiko Steiner. I'm a principal level designer currently at Lost Boys Interactive, as you can see right there. Before, I worked at Zynga and Star Wars Hunters. Before that, I worked at Blizzard on World of Warcraft. I worked on Skylanders for a really long time. Before that, I was at Sega working on Iron Man 2, the video game. Before that, I worked on a 2D racing game. It was very strange. It was all in Flash. It's called Vector City Racers. Before that, I worked at Totally Games, and I learned how to do all of this at the Guildhall. Um, if you want to check out my portfolio, I'm actually going to talk about a little bit about it later. But it's on my website. I really dig into specifically parts of my process and everything. So the big question that my friend asked was, as a game designer, what do you do day to day? Like, what is your day to day job? And the answer is it really depends. And I know that's a really annoying answer. Uh, but it depends on a lot of different things, right? So it depends on what kind of game you're working on. It depends on what kind of company you're working at, and it depends on honestly your skill set and your um, capabilities, like kind of the skills that you know, right? Like what you can actually do, what you can actually implement, and then even further, like kind of one step more is what part of the production process you're in. So I'm looking over here just to let you know I'm kind of glancing because I'm double checking that I'm recording the right thing, but also I have my notes so that I don't just ADHD wander you through an entire forest. Um, I specifically want to talk about indie versus AAA because my friend who is asking this question is very much looking more towards indie aspects of that. But my most of my career has been in AAA, so a lot of talking about game development requires that context of understanding where this person is talking from, and it changes based on whether they're talking from AAA versus indie. Now, there's a lot of different definitions for what those two things are. So specifically for me, the big difference between an indie project versus a AAA project is pretty much who's in charge at the end of the day, right? Because on indie projects, it's going to be whoever is the leader of that indie company, the person who's kind of driving that goal, versus in AAA, it's usually an exec, right? So you kind of you get told what to make. There's this frequent misunderstanding about game designers, which people perceive all game designers to be almost a creative director, right? They think that we sit in a room and we write things down on paper and then we hand them off to programmers and artists and we say, this is the game you're building, go build it. And that's really not it. There's usually one designer who does that, and that's the creative director. um, most rank and file uh, most rank and file uh, designers do not get that kind of control. And in fact, really, just now at Principal, I'm beginning to feel again like I have control in the AAA space of saying like, oh no, a system shouldn't be designed that way. We should instead design it this way. So that kind of leads you into this question of, well, what's the difference between my my notes are getting covered. What's the difference between indie and AAA? Really, the answer is who's in charge, right? But you're also kind of talking about team sizes, right? Because indie team sizes are going to be much smaller versus AAA. I mean, I would be stunned to find a AAA company that had a team size that was less than 100 people. And you're talking about size of the team, size of the game, really, that you're making, which those two things should theoretically be related. They're not always, but they should be. The size of the team, the size of the budget, because, indies obviously are going to have much smaller budgets than AAA games, but also, if you're a publisher-funded game, usually the publisher has a very vested interest in that game releasing. So if you reach a point where it's like, oh crap, like we really need more money or more time, with a publisher you can usually get more money, whereas with an indie company, like there may be a point where it's just like, well, sucks, we gotta ship what we got. And those are kind of like things that kind of end up being very different. So it kind of affects what the job is, right? And to explain that better, I worked at Toys for Bob on Skylanders. I worked on 4 Skylanders games. And their level designers were blockout people. So we built a gray box, which is what you can see here on Unreal right now. I have an example of one. The just kind of starting template one. But they build a gray box, and then an artist comes along later and makes it all pretty. But at Toys for Bob, they also didn't have gameplay engineers, so we were also kind of gameplay programmers, in addition to being level designers, which really brings you a lot more into that game design umbrella. So, high level, game design, but then you have a bunch of different flavors of it, right? So the way, it's kind of that Venn diagram concept. All level designers are also probably game designers. Not all game designers are level designers, right? So most narrative designers could also be game designers, or at least understand enough about game design to be able to do that job. But not all game designers can be narrative designers, right? So the idea is game designer is this high level thing, and then you have specializations within it. It's a lot like if you imagine like an artist, right? And then you have concept artists, then you have character artists, then you have, environmental artists, right? And so these are very different jobs that are all kind of in that same, sub grouping. So the way I like to explain it to people who don't know anything about game development is game designers are the scientists who have the rats that go through the maze to get the cheese. So the game designer is the scientist. The level designer is the scientist that built the maze. The rats are the players. We really want them to get through the level, and we really want them to get the cheese. The cheese is the reward, right? And so we want them to get through the level without them realizing that we're helping them get through it. So game design is, at its core, I believe, setting player expectations and then meeting those expectations, right? Players get really frustrated when they think they should be able to do something and they can't. So you want to set those expectations. This is what the game is going to be. This is what your core game loop is going to be. This is what your moment-to-moment gameplay is going to be. And then you meet those expectations. Game design is not just coming up with ideas, it's implementing them. That's the hard part. And, honestly, the answer is it's a huge pain in the ass. So when you're talking about actually implementing, a level designer, you're slinging mesh, right? You're putting blocks down, you're building out spaces, you're constantly thinking about line of sight and flow and how big an area is and how the player's going to feel moving through it. Like there's a lot of discussion about like game feel and how to guide the player and, color theory. There's all these kind of things you can dig into in level design that's really about moving a player through a world without them realizing it. And then you kind of get into things like narrative design, which is a lot more, it depends on the company. So some companies' narrative designers are level designers, but they're a lot more storytelling focused, so they're really focused on building out these little vignettes that tell the story without using text, right? Then some companies, narrative designers are all in text, and that's all they do. They just sit there and write text documents all day and write voiceover lines, and then they help record voiceover lines and direct VO actors and all that kind of stuff. And then sometimes they're the person that's sitting there writing down every single word that is said by every NPC in the game. It's worth noting that every design job I talk about, I have done at some point in my career or the other. So that's one of the other big differences between indie and AAA is that in an indie studio, when you're a designer, you're almost certainly going to be doing all of the design jobs. You're going to be a narrative designer, and you're going to be a level designer, and you're going to be a combat designer, and you're going to be, like whatever it happens to be, that's the job you're going to do, because it's an indie company, there's only like 5 of you. Whoever knows how to do the job is going to do it. Whereas, when you get to like AAA, you're going to end up having much more narrow job bands, much more narrow task lists. So the idea being is that, at Toys for Bob, when we worked on Skylanders, I got to do a lot of different things, because we didn't really silo people out like that, and we had, these very broad job descriptions. Whereas like on World of Warcraft, teams 3-4 times bigger, you've got to be a lot more specific, you've got to be a lot more controlled, and so you kind of have to get people to stay in their lane, and you have to say, okay, like, I understand that you know how to do these other 4 design jobs, but we really just want you to do this one. So when I was at Blizzard, I actually wasn't even a level designer. Their level designers are a lot more art focused, so they're making textures and making assets, whereas like I'm a gray box level designer, which is I build things. I can go back if someone gave me a whole bunch of static meshes or a bunch of textures, I could go back and make it pretty myself, but I'm really thinking about the gameplay and the flow from space to space and interaction. So that's my constant thought process is thinking about that as opposed to making this beautiful space. Level design, you're thinking about pacing and flow. We talk about flow. It's if you think about if you've ever been at a convention, right, and there's a large group of people who are moving around, right, that's flow, right? Like that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, if you approach a hallway, a T intersection, a hallway, and one goes to the left and one goes to the right, the hallway to the right, there's an open door, there's a bright light, you can hear people talking, like that's a very like positive pull. Whereas if you look to the left and there's a rusty door that's got like 3 locks on it and there's one light that's flickering and sparking, but other than that all the lights are off, so it's just a dark ass scary hallway, most people are going to go to the right because like it's just kind of a level design thing, right? Like using all of these tools to draw the player around and to really think about flow and how people move. This is part of the reason why when people talk about level design, you'll almost certainly hear them start talking about Disneyland, right? Disneyland is very much a real world example of level design. So we talked about a little bit about narrative design. There's also like systems design. That's a little more focused. You're going to spend a lot more time in Excel. It's a lot more focused on numbers and balancing. You're thinking about combat. Specifically, one of my favorite GDC lectures is the Halo team talking about adjusting the fire rate of the sniper rifle, right? And so that's combat designers, or systems designers, like really getting into those, this class can do this much DPS per second, but then they have, they'll take this much damage per second. And then you have these other classes, and balancing the game and getting it to work that way. Combat design is a lot about, enemies and what abilities the enemies have. One of my favorite comments ever made or statements ever made was Candace Thomas saying, it's not her job as a WoW boss designer to beat the player. It's her job to lose very convincingly, right? And like that's really what combat design is losing very convincingly. So there's all these different flavors of design that may or may not fall under a job, depending on the company, depending on the size of the team, depending on the game. Really the only advice I would give someone is pick one to focus in, right? Like pick one specific subtree to focus in, but take time to know how all the other ones work, because even if you don't ever actually do that job, knowing how it works will make it easier for you to work with other designers. But then also it makes it easier for you to flex if you need to, right? So a lot of jobs I've found I've ended up being very valuable to the team. When I have found I've ended up being very valuable to the team is when it's a situation where I can flex and I can use these other skill sets as well as the thing that I'm pretty good at, which is building levels. So level design, what it is in that specific subset. Usually you start with paper maps, so you just kind of sketch out an idea, you figure out what you want to build, and then you actually have to build it out in Editor. Um, okay. So paper maps, we also do them in Miro. Sometimes, like WoW, they build theirs in Visio, and so there's kind of a lot of different processes, and it's really whichever one works for you to just kind of think it out. What the goal of a paper map, what the goal of that kind of pre-production kind of thought process out is what are the gameplay mechanics that are going into this game? How are we going to build a level that really shows this off? How are we going to build something that is fun to move through and some fun to engage with and look at while also doing all of this gameplay? Because really, you want your level design and your gameplay to just be like this. Like they want to constantly be interacting with each other and assisting each other and making the other one look good, right? Like that's how it works. So then you also, your job is kind of different based on what part of the production cycle you're in. So pre-production, specifically for designers, is a lot of meetings talking about stuff, talking about other games that do similar things, what your core game loop is, what your pillars are, what your market target core audience, what your market audience is, like whatever, and figuring out which games like most accurately serve those markets, how you're going to adjust what you're going to make to serve that market better, or even like how your game that is a totally new idea is going to serve those markets. And even at the indie level, like even when you're not trying to get a company to give you like $5 million to go make this game, although that number's way out of date now, but like you're trying to get a big pile of money to go make a game, you kind of have to convince them that there's a market there. There's an audience for that game to come and buy it. But even if you're not in that situation, like even if you're an indie game, you're making the game for yourself, and it's going to be, your baby, you still have to have that player in mind, right? Or what version of you is that player? And the reason why I say that is because, like, I can't just design a game for what I think is fun 100% of the time, because I think it's great fun to go into World of Warcraft with 29 other people and go kill an internet dragon, right? Like, that's great. That's amazingly fun with my friends. The second that is 29 people I do not know, not fun for me anymore. I do not want to be there. I'm out, right? And so those are two very different things. So, if I were making my, dream opus game or whatever, I'm actually pretty sure it wouldn't even be multiplayer. It might be couch co-op, but that's it. And so it's interesting though, because if I'm making a multiplayer game, I have to be able to be the person that this game is targeting, right? I have to mentally think about, okay, if I'm the target audience, how am I building this game? What are the things I'm invested in, and what are the things I'm going to want to do as part of the game? So on the cycles of the project though, you're going to have like pre-production, that's all your documentation, planning, and then you kind of have production, which is where you're building everything. Hopefully you have really good producers wherever you are. Producers can pretty much make or break a game. It's really interesting, just kind of keeping people on track, keeping them focused. You want to have like that kind of creative director person or that vision holder person that's keeping everyone focused on your pillars and making sure that all your decisions are being made with that in mind. And then you eventually reach a point where you're at alpha, right? And so alpha is kind of that first like checkpoint where you're like, okay, the game's pretty much there. Most of the stuff is in. May or may not work great. It's definitely not polished up. And then you kind of start playing it, and then you start polishing based on where you're at and where you need to be in your deadline, right? So all games are made based on time, scope, and resources. Resources can be people or money. And so timelines, and then scope, which is how big or small the game is, and then how many people you have, to do the work. But even that, you can't just add more people. There's a whole book on it. It's all things. It's the idea that you can't have 9 women make a baby in a month, right? It doesn't really work that way. Sometimes you have to have parts done before you can do other parts, which is actually, for level design, it's actually one of the interesting things. A lot of companies in the past have made levels that they're very bespoke, right? So each level is handcrafted totally unique. Each piece of art in that level, an environmental artist has to come along and build a piece of art to go in that space that's, that we're gonna show off here. And we've kind of been moving away from that as an industry into more modular pieces where it's like, okay, instead of me taking a wall, so let's take for example this one, instead of me having this floor plane out here and then I just scale it to be whatever size I want it. It may or may not be the right size, it may or may not be the right scale, but an artist will come along and fix it later, was kind of how it used to be done. But that takes a lot longer than modular piece kits, which are what a lot of companies are moving towards, which is where you have like a set number of pieces and it's like, okay, this is a floor piece, this is a wall piece, this is a stair piece, and then you're a level designer just kind of building out of those Legos. But it's really cool because it lets art go ahead and start working immediately, right? So as opposed to the old method of doing it where we build up these bespoke levels and then an artist would come along later and make it look pretty, like the artist doesn't have to come along later and make it look pretty because the artist can just be working on those modular pieces, and then when they check them in and they assign it, it just suddenly propagates out to your level and it's like, oh my gosh, there's suddenly all this cool art. Sorry, I got distracted again. So talking about post-alpha, so that's where you're polishing stuff up, really getting the game solid and amazing. But then you eventually move to beta, which is kind of where you're like, okay, we're done. We've added everything we're going to add. We've cut everything we need to cut. Now we're just fixing bugs, and we're getting the game really stable so that we can ship it. It used to be that cycle of going from like pre-production to post beta, right, where you've finished the game. That used to be between like 2 and 5 years. Those timelines are getting longer. I hate that. As a game designer, I'm much more interested in getting something done and moving on to the next new cool thing. That may be the ADHD too, though. So we talked about, your core audience, your target market, your game pillars, who you're targeting, what the goals of your game are. And there's also there's a lot of lectures and books and all this kind of stuff on this. There are people who will talk about the archetypes, like there's 12 player archetypes, explorers and killers and achievers and that kind of thing. And yeah, you're probably going to want to pick one or two of those, and that's going to be your target. And it changes all of your little design decisions, right? So you have these pillars because that helps set up the framework and the outline and the constraints for the rest of the game. It's actually shockingly difficult to make something when you don't know the boundaries of what you can and should be making, when you don't know who your target is. I forgot to exit my Discord. Hang on, let me. Quit Discord. Okay. Really figuring out who the person is, who the group is that you're making this game for, and then every design decision ties back into that, right? Like what works best with this game. And then, sometimes that's an argument, sometimes that's we implement both, figure out which one works better, all that kind of thing. So, who knows? That kind of varies from company to company. I also figure, the indie games, they're smaller, they're going to be smaller games, and so you're going to have, way less complicated stuff to deal with. So one of the things that I specifically talk about is Unreal. There's lots of people who talk about, like Godot and Unity. Unity less so now. Sure, we can save those. But I talk a lot about Unreal because I've been in the industry since 2007. I went to the Guildhall for 2 years before that. I learned Unreal along with 6 other editors at the game industry, at the school I went to. So I learned 7 editors in 21 months. Of those editors, 7 of them, 3 of them are still being used, as far as I know, by game companies. Although I don't think anyone's made anything in Source in a very long time. So Source is the Half-Life 2 Valve. It's all in source. And then there's the Creation Kit. I learned that one for it was Oblivion at the time, but Skyrim, it's the Elder Scrolls games are all based off of that tool set. And then Unreal. And they taught us Unreal because they said most game companies use Unreal, and I found that to be true. Most of the jobs I apply to, they either require or very much want Unreal experience. So that's why I recommend it. It's also free. You can get it. You can also get these really cool asset packs. So if you don't know, in the marketplace in Unreal, every month they have. Oh look, the new packs are up for the month. They weren't up the other day yet. So yeah, you just literally just burp, 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 burp. And now we have 5 new packs. So that's what, that was like $250 something worth packs. We are totally just about to get for free. $290 worth of packs. Oh, snap. Yeah, so every month you should be coming in here and grabbing these. If you don't have them, it's just like the free games that you get. You absolutely want the free packs. So then, okay, so you've bought some new packs. Cool, cool, cool. We're gonna add them to our project. It literally just pops up, and you just say add project, and then it's gonna queue it up. Oh, this stupid thing is still. Why is that like that? Actually, you know what? Let's close this and reopen. Although I may have to task manager kill it to make it work. Yeah. Can I cancel that? Alright. Well, it's funny because I recorded this video to try and fix all of the janky stuff with the old video. It did not help. Alright, let's go Unreal. Is it under Epic? There it is. Kill it, kill it, kill it. When in doubt, turn it off and turn it on again. Alright. There are way fewer packs in here than there were last time. Alright, well, let's go add project. Add project. Let's see, these are all already in there. That's actually pretty exciting. Why didn't you open the thing? Yeah, having a big pile of materials is always really nice to have. Okay, let's see. So yeah, let's see, what else can we talk about while we're waiting for this? So asset packs are actually really useful. They're pretty helpful to really prototype stuff out really quickly. There are sales on them all the time. I would, however, like put the huge like asterisk on there of being like, there's a lot of them out there, and a lot of them are not very good, mostly because they're made by people who make asset packs for a living, as opposed to people who make games for a living. So they're not really super performant. They'll have like tons and tons of polys on things. And so as a game designer, you're usually pretty worried about performance, just from the perspective of if the game is chuggy and doesn't play very well, people will not play it. So there's kind of that really big important aspect of, you really want to make sure your game is running as smoothly as possible. And in fact, there are games that if it isn't performant, it won't actually run the game properly. It's really interesting. All right, let's see. Are you going to add to the project? Or are you going to error out too? Initializing, there we go. Okay, then we're going to add that one. That one's actually probably going to be really helpful for us. Anyway, so most of them are not great for making games. But the other kind of added benefit, though, is a lot of these will come with blueprint stuff. So when I was talking about all the different kinds of designers earlier, I talked about you kind of pick a thing to focus in, like whether that's going to be narrative or combat, or sometimes even people would be like systems design, or like level design is kind of another kind of higher level focus of design. Another thing that kind of happens sometimes is designers will often end up also being scripters, which is kind of like programming light. Usually you're using a visual scripting language. Very often you will be scripting things up, getting it to work, it's great, and then you hand it off to a programmer who goes and writes it in C++, and so it's super performant, it's great, and it doesn't have to worry about internet lag and all that kind of stuff. But because you implemented it first, like there's not that game of like telephone to try and get it working properly, right? You just implement it the way you want it to work, and it just works. So yeah, that's always a really funny kind of cycle. Is like whenever you're trying to work with other sub teams to get things implemented the way you think it should be, you're having to write out documentation, lots of meetings, lots of review, lots of discussion. And so it's actually really valuable as a designer if you're really good at explaining what your intent, what your end goal of a thing is, as opposed to a lot of people will say, oh, just make it like the game. And the problem with that is that, they may not have played that game, or they may have played that game and didn't play that aspect of it, or they may not understand what it was about that system or that mechanic that you... Yeah, sure, why not? That you wanted to have in your game, right? So being able to explain to other people and having a very common language to be able to explain those design mechanics is actually really valuable. I worked with a guy for a while, and we both played a lot of WoW, and so it was really easy for me to be like, it's this WoW boss's mechanic with this other WoW boss's mechanic with this other thing. Oh, we don't go in that way. We want to go in... just want to open up. Oh, look, they all came back. Weird. Normally I would straight up reboot instead of going back in, but I don't want to stop recording the video. Okay, so this is Unreal. At least for a level designer, this is how they would look at Unreal. Not a lot of people have the place actors thing open. You can open it right there. But it's pretty much what comes with Unreal. So like if you need lights, there's basic static mesh things. This is BSP. It's probably too deep for the purview of this video, but BSP is how we used to make levels. Then binary space partition is how we used to make levels. And then they kind of realized, oh, that's not very performant. It's really hard to have a lot of BSP and not bring your computer chugging to a halt. So if we want to have giant levels with lots of stuff in them, we have to figure out a more performant way, and they figured out static mesh is a lot more performant because it all gets pre-baked. Everything gets done, originally, and so it's all just done and it looks great. And so that's why everything's kind of moved to static mesh in the time I've been in the industry. So I joined the industry in 2007, so a lot of my information will probably also be taking into account the context of the timeline that I've been in the industry. So there's things that I'll call new, and it's only been around for like 5 years. It's like, that's not new. It's been around for 5 years, but in my career, it's only been here for a third of it, right? So BSP is a thing. There's also a concept of like additive and subtractive, but that's really getting into the nitty gritty. Yeah, so on any given day, as a level designer, my job is to come in the editor. I usually work in perspective mode. There are others who will do the quadrant system, and so you'll have perspective, and then you'll have like top and then left and right in the other ones. But I like working in perspective, and if I need like a top view, I'll switch to top view. Although usually in top view, I work in wireframe, so I can see the mesh and see how complicated it is. Whereas in perspective, I'm usually in lit because it looks nicer. Yeah. So level design, day to day, a lot of what we're talking about, we're thinking about is flow, characters, players moving through the world, what they're looking at, what they're seeing, vistas, line of sight, how do we direct them through the level, and part of that is just like actively building a level. So what I've done here is I've literally just gone to the top. This is the content browser. Oh, sorry, real quick, tour of Unreal. So we've got our viewport, our Unreal stuff we can place, which is all the actors and player starts, and all that kind of stuff. Down here is your content browser, so this is all the stuff you've added or the stuff you're working on. So like your levels will be down here and everything. Then over here is your outliner. This is every item that's been placed in Unreal. It's really cool. Then your details pane is really just kind of how you're messing with things. I most often use this for scale. Or then, collision is pretty important, whether it collides or not. And then down here in rendering is a really nice, interesting one, which is visible, which means you can see it, or then actor hidden in game, which means it can be something that is only for in the editor, right? So one of the things that we use this for a lot is text render actors. You can drop these down in the world. And then you can literally go in here and enter your text and say, this is gonna be a cool tower. And then that's actually the text that appears. So whenever I start building, I'll actually usually use these. I do really big, large, rough blockouts for stuff. So like I'll be like, okay, we're going to make a tower over here in this corner, and I've got everything on grid. I like keeping things on grid. I'm very nitpicky like that. But then I will literally put this text render thing here so that anybody who's looking at this in editor will know what I'm going to be working on and where we're going to go from here. Archway thing. That looks so cool. Oh, it's going to take it a minute. That is so many polys. Oh my gosh. Also, this is going to be really funny too. It's going to have terrible collision. They always have terrible. Oh no, this one's actually really good. Alright, well, whoever made the flowers and plants and nature pack. Oh, I bet you their flowers and stuff are really awful though. For collision. Collision's one of the problems that level designers most often run into. Wow, look at that. Because inherently things kind of interact with collision in weird ways, and so anytime you see something like just suddenly launch and go flying off, that was almost certainly collision issue. That is really, really precise collision, and is going to make that extremely non-performant. Yeah, that's going to be a really funny item if anybody ever tries to ship a game with it. Anyway, Yeah, so you put the text redirector in there, and then you can literally say, don't show it in game. And where'd that go? There it is. So you can say actor hidden in game. So then that way when you actually play through, you won't see the big text messages. Although I only turn those off at a certain point, because... no, look at that flower. Although that is a very fancy flower. It's got a lot of stuff going on it. Anyway, yeah. So let me go ahead and delete that. Yeah. So you know, we mess with a lot of stuff over here. Sometimes you'll do lighting. Sometimes you'll have to do combat design. Sometimes you'll have to do enemy spawning and like having the enemy run around, and you have to build nav mesh. You know, nav mesh is actually a lot easier than it used to be. You used to have to like actually build it out by hand, and now it auto runs most of the time. But yeah, so like I'll be like, oh, this is where I want to go, and then I'll see like, oh, do we have any stairs or a ramp? I know we have ramps. Stair. See if we got any stairs. Yeah, and so like sometimes you'll be really lucky and you'll have like a really nice set of stairs, and you just end up using those everywhere. Moving things around. So yeah, so level design is a lot of what I like to call slinging mesh. You just kind of building stuff around. Oh, you get really annoyed whenever they build something and it's not exactly to the grid, or they put the point on the corner of a stair instead of on the corner of the actual model. Like, wouldn't it be logical to have it right there? Anyway, so yeah, this one's probably got its own little special things. Although at least its pivot point is in a better spot for us. It's at least in the center. Yeah, and so a lot of level design, like day to day, is actually I get a bunch of Lego toys, and I just use that's you hold down Alt and it copies the thing, and like I'm just like building levels out of all of my little Lego toys that I've been given. You know, so static meshes, like all of these are effectively like little toys I can use to build things. There's a nice Athena statue there. Yeah, I like the museum pack. It's got a lot of really cool statues and neat things going on. It's got a lot of glass windows too. Boop. So then we've got a statue. Doo-doo. Yeah, so then like you know, sometimes if we're working on a game, we say plate from here. So this is level design. A lot of things you talk about, just flow, line of sight, but you also talk a lot about scale. And scale is, oh wow, those stairs, they have collision on the first half, but not the second. How bizarre. Do you have collision? Yeah, you have collision. Okay, all right. So we talk about scale a lot, and it's pretty much just how things appear next to the player, right? So this is actually really good scale. This is this statue is a nice size, right? Let me. So we know that one's a good size. Does this not have the museum? Where's my museum statue? Because I know she's wrong. Look, okay, so this is what we talk about at scale a lot, right? So if you're a player and you're running through a museum, right? Like, so whatever reason, this is the museum game, and you run up and this is the statue that you're confronted with. Like, you're like, oh, that's ridiculous. Like, it's so small. Whereas, like, the other one, it's like, oh, no, that's at least close to statue size. Although, in reality, it would probably be more like this, right? So you'd have this huge statue that you're coming up to and you're looking up at, and you go, oh god, they spent so much time modeling all of the little pieces of hair and everything, and so yes, we should get much closer. So you notice how on this one the artist took the shortcut route. Remember, time and scope. So you only have so much time, your scope gets smaller. But yeah, so a lot of scale, a lot of building spaces out, a lot of thinking about how spaces fit together. So a really cool way of showing this without building an entire level here is to uh, do this. So this is a website. It's NoClip. I really like this site. This guy, I assume it's guy. I actually don't know. Has literally managed to load up the actual files, game files from some games. And I always pick Ocarina of Time because most people have played it. And so this is Kakaira Village, which is the like village where you first go, and it's like the Skulltula house, and you get the chickens, and you fly with the chickens, and Death Mountain's up there, and the graveyard's back there, and at some point you go down the well, right? So this is the village as it was in the N64 game, right? So I mean, you can see just how blocky everything is. Like everything is textures. Like they're the textures even stretched, right? So that tells me that they weren't even caring about making extra textures. They didn't have the space for it, right? Because you remember everything had to be on that cartridge. Um, but if we think about this from a level design perspective, when you're building a space and you're thinking about you want to be able to draw the player around, right? So just from this shot, right? So this is about the angle you would come in. Automatically right off the bat, we've got some different colored buildings. So there's one that's just dramatically different, like it's a different colored roof, different colored walls, and that immediately draws your eye and says, "Hey, this is different." Human beings tend to not like things that are different, and so we draw attention to it. Our brains pull our attention to it because they're worried that something different means danger. Anyway, but you'll also notice like you can see kind of two different stairways kind of going off, so you're being kind of presented with two paths here, which when you get down to here, it then opens it up, right? So now you're being presented with two paths this way, right? But by this point, by the point where you're starting to see these paths, like you can no longer see those other ones. You don't want to give players too many choices at once. They get choice paralysis. So the beautiful thing about even being able to look at old games is a lot of the design lessons are still very, very true. But you just think about the simplicity of the space they've built here and how it works for level design, right? So I don't know if you remember very well, but the first time you come into Kakaira Village, you learn about chicken gliding. And you do that because there's a thing over here. It's like a chicken, and you need that chicken, right? And so you go because you need two, because you got to chuck one over a thing, and then you got to glide over into it, and then pick up the thing. Yeah. So, but you need to get to that one. So you have to come up here, and you have to glide down over here, right? But the player could just walk up and around unless you put a wall in the way, right? So it's level design that's constantly thinking about the game design and how to teach the player how to do things. And so for this specific example, it was actually the first time you come in here, you have that immediate tutorial of learning to pick up the chicken and glide to get I think there's a heart container that they show you really quickly and you get. But then once you've learned that, they then turn around and they make you do it like 6 more times just in this tiny little space. So also just to kind of show you some of the fun stuff with the things, like they didn't even build out like the bottom of the world mostly. There are no interiors to the houses that exist in this map, right? Because you would transition to another map. You wouldn't actually use this one. It's really basic, really, simplistic. Your things go into points so the player isn't looking outside the world. When you start up here, like you've got that really kind of faked vista back there. And this is a really cool level, right? Like this is a really well-designed town. So the other really cool thing though is Ocarina of Time was remade. And so one of my favorite things to do is to go up here and look at this exact same space in the 3DS version, which you can see is totally different. Like immediately we're assaulted by, there's the textures are so much better now, and they've got more detail. Like clearly they changed the way they saved the file because you can see the NPCs now, you can see the temporary stuff that isn't there the whole time. Like we have the windmill is fully in there now. Oh shit, you can even see the guards. Look at that. So clearly they changed the way they save the file when they updated it from the N64 to the 3DS. Doesn't surprise me. That's part of why remakes take so much time. Anyway, but then you have all of like these, you can even see the chicken is here, and you come over here, and you're like, now I know how to get to that chicken. You gotta grab this guy first. And then you come down and get this chicken, and then you go chuck them both over a wall over here so that you can have like 4 chickens over here for some guy or something. I think there's one of the guys you have to collect up all his chickens. But yeah, so like it's one of those things of like, they clearly had more memory they could work with, and they did a lot of stuff. And you'll notice like they drew even more attention. They wanted to make this building very different, right? They really wanted. Oh, look at that! They put in the little Triforce because this is Impa's house, right? Like this is where you're headed when you come here the first time. Our vista looks a lot better. The alleyways are a lot cleaner now, right? So they juke around a little bit more. And I forgot to look at it, but one of the really funny things is if you look at the fence in the other one, it is literally just a plane with the texture on both sides, right? Like it's not actually a physical fence. Whereas now, we've upgraded to we have 4 planes for this. So yeah, so like this is actually a really cool way of looking at other levels and how they're put together and how they're implemented. So not a lot of newer stuff. I think they've got some of on the PC section. They've got some newer stuff like the Dark Souls. But I don't know those levels as well, so I'm not as confident talking about them. But yeah, so like again, though, you're thinking about it from a level design perspective, right? There's actually hiding that building now, so it's not drawing your attention as much. But then, you have the guy, and then you have the windmill that's pulling you in. And when you get to like right here, and you're kind of looking around, and it's like, oh my god, there's so much going on. And I think there's actually a guy running along this thing in the game, like he's running along this, and so you kind of get drawn over here by the movement, right? So movement's a really big thing. We have to put in enemies and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, so another thing I just wanted to like kind of talk about is it's really different. Every project you work on, every game you work on, every company you work at, it's all going to be a little different for what you're actually doing. And so in my portfolio, I actually talk. I get very specific about what I worked on in a level, or how I went through the process. And I talk. I actually break it down, and I talk about like where I got the idea from, then how I implemented it, and then what were the problems, right? And so it's another thing, like we talk a lot about problems. And so what an experienced game designer is going to get you versus a new game designer is they've encountered these problems before. They know how to fix them, and they know whether they're going to be a big deal or not. And so I was talking about explaining to my boss that it was just, it's just these 2 parts of a WoW boss fight put together. So, and I talk about the challenges, but I also talk about the really exciting things that I did and how I solved those challenges. Because really, that's what you're looking for as a game designer, is a person who figures out how to implement the game, how to actually get it to work in such a way that the player understands how the game works and can figure it out and have fun and engage with the game in all the right ways. And I say right, but it's there are some game designers who will do the thing where they try to punish the player if they're not playing the game the right way, and it's like, no, that's not how you do it. It's just like training a dog, or dealing with a small child, right? Like we know that is the idea that you reward the player for doing the things you want them to do, and just ignore them whenever they're doing the things you don't want them to do. And they'll figure it out. They'll eventually get there, or they'll have fun ignoring you, and at that point it's out of your hands. But yeah, so a game designer, like most of the time, is trying to figure out how to implement these things, whether it's through a visual scripting language, or using tools that have been made by other developers, or whether it's just cobbling together pieces that you've bought off the asset store and are trying to make work in your Unreal thing. Like however you're doing that, that's what a game designer is doing every day, and most of it is actually here in Unreal. There's a lot of a lot of building things out, a lot of running through it, a lot of watching people play it and watching them do wrong things. Yeah, invariably you'll hear me talk about like having the T junction and literally having a wall. I had a texture on the wall that was a giant arrow pointing to the right, and I would watch players play it, and they would get to the wall and they would look around and they'd go, I don't know where to go. And it's giant arrow saying go that way, and they could not see it. It was just invisible to them on the wall. But it's a lot of putting stuff down. There's a lot of kit bashing, which is a term we use to refer to when you take things that were never intended to be used for a purpose, and we use them for that purpose. So, like, if you can imagine, whoa, that is hilarious. Look at how it freaks out when it's on that thing. Usually you only see stuff like that when there's two of the asset overlapping each other, so it's really funny to see it on a single asset like that. It makes me think it's badly made. Makes me worried it's badly made, I guess. But like the idea of kit bashing is just you like take things and you put things together that were never intended to be used together, and then they kind of work. Game developers do this a lot. I think one of my favorite ones was they actually showed in Telltale, The Wolf Among Us. They had the wolf head on the wall, and it was literally just the whole wolf was jammed into the back of the wall. It was just the head sticking out. Totally valid game development technique. I have absolutely seen that in other games. Hilariously funny every time it happens. And it happens a lot. It's really common. It's totally a thing. You'll notice you'll see like compiled, or sometimes they use the word merged. That's where they take a bunch of small static meshes and they merge them all into one. I bet you they have the collision all smooshed together for this guy. Oh, or it just does not have collision. Cool. Alright, well. Yeah, see that guy's collision's pretty good. That one's collision. The museum asset pack's pretty good. But yeah, I mean, that's a lot of what it is. It's just making the game happen. Oh, I was going to show you blueprints. real quick. Let me turn off my static mesh here real quick. That's camera shake. Oh, there was a lamp. Let me find a lamp. Cute. See, it's got BP on it. Hey, look at our street lamp. Alright, so then we can go in and we can say click to edit the blueprint. So Blueprints is Unreal's visual scripting language. So designers will frequently use this. This is the construction script. So this pretty much says whenever it's being made, set all this stuff. And then when you see these things like this, these are variables that have been created. So it's just like it's like programming light. These are variables that have been created, and then you say instant editable, or however that's pronounced. So what that means is that whenever you look at, these are the defaults, right? Whatever's set in this version is the default. But out here, every instance of it, I can change these settings, right? Whether it cast shadow, intensity, color, or light. I can change those per version of this item. So if I have 100 of these, I can make one of them blue, which would almost certainly then be a secret, right? Like that's how it would work. Event graphs. So there's kind of a couple of different types of when something gets initialized in a game, and some things are construction, right? So that's done in the build. Like it knows how that's going to work. Whenever that thing is spawned in, it follows that code and it makes it happen. This is for when you're doing more gameplay stuff, so things that are happening. You almost never want to do event ticks. That's every frame of the game. But like active begin overlap, that's when you put a trigger volume in, so it's just like an invisible box, and when someone walks through it, you can then be like, oh, is this the player? If it's the player, do a thing. And so that's a lot less game design now. It used to be a lot more, but now it's more writing specs that engineers do, because blueprints are great. They're great for prototyping stuff. They're great for designer implementing something, but then usually you hand it off to an engineer who goes in and rewrites it in C++, because Blueprints aren't great for multiplayer games. They don't work great when you have possibility for lag, and so you really want that to be in C++. So it's super fast and speedy for all of that thing. But yeah, that's what game design is. It's a lot of thinking about all of the pieces of a game and how they should all work together. Um, it's a lot like I'm trying to think. It's like you're a lot like a conductor, right? Or cat wrangler. Cat wrangler is really what I would talk about. Because like the game design less so than level design. Level design is kind of the kind of point where everything comes together, right? So you have systems designers who are working on combat stuff, and you have AI designers who are working on enemies, and then you have, environmental artists who are putting art into level, and then you have, you know, um, characters that are NPCs that have to be able to move around and do stuff, and you have, you know, collectibles that you have to hide around and pacing and all this stuff, and all of that comes into a level designer who puts it all into the level and makes it all work together properly, um, which is a very bizarre job. And then yeah, so the game design is the kind of high level above that. But yeah, I think that was the really quick. I say really quick. It's an hour. Really quick explanation of what a game designer versus a level designer is, and then what a level designer does all day, which is pretty much play with Lego blocks to build out worlds. It seems like a really simple job, and then at the same time, it is annoyingly painful and difficult because things won't feel right. Your scale will be off. You know, yeah, there's a lot of things you kind of run into. So like, you know, as a player, actually, I think that street lamp is too tall, actually. So if you're looking at it from a scale, maybe not. Maybe not. If you're looking at it from a scale point of view, it may be a little tall. I don't know. Depends on how tall the buildings end up being. But see, like this should be a little bit taller than that. Should be the first floor of the building. Anyway, so yeah, but that's a lot of level design, is putting things in and then running around and seeing how it feels. So there's a lot of fixing bugs and making things work. But let me know if you have any more questions, and